Hello and welcome back to revise GCSEhistory.co.uk. This video is the first video in the topic Law and Order in the West, and in this video today, in video 1, we're going to be looking at the factors that encouraged lawlessness in the West. Okay, so an introduction to law and order. In the West, before the 1880s, outlaws and gunfighters were often law officers and vice versa, so the criminals were the person who were the law officers. And as populations increased, towns and counties began to have proper forms of local government as populations increased. However, before the 1880s, the West was a violent and lawless place. So it's incredibly violent. Most people were armed, so there was lots of guns being fired, train robberies, bank robberies, lots of criminals about, all that sort of thing, gun crime. It was just basically a mental place. It was very lawless and very violent. There were many outlaws who were criminals who were wanted, and posters were put up like this. So this is a wanted poster for Billy the Kid, and he's wanted dead or alive. And in this video today, we're going to be looking at the factors that encouraged lawlessness in the West. Why was it so crazy? What were the factors that encouraged this lawlessness? Before we look at this, I just want to speak about something called dime novels, as I do think you need to be aware of them for the exam. It doesn't massively link into the topic of today's video, but I'm just trying to slot this bit of information in at this position. So dime novels. Dime novels first made an appearance in the 1860s, and they were hugely successful. They were named dime novels because they originally cost just a dime, but later they became more expensive. But the name still stuck anyway. Dime novels are often based on the lives of real people. For example, Jesse James was a real person, and he was an outlaw. And dime novels were written about Jesse James. So the Jesse James stories is this poster is advertising here. And the stories were fictional and often massively exaggerated for entertainment purposes. Dime novels helped to create the myth of the frontier hero and doing the right thing. So dime novels were read by many people in the West, as they gave quite an exaggerated, fictional, and quite a fantasy view of what living in the West was like, and what the Wild West was really like. And many people enjoyed reading them, found them entertaining, and sort of saw their frontier heroes in the novel, and aspired to be like them. So they were hugely successful. I just think you need to be aware of that point for the exam. So, now let's get back to the main focus of today's video. What factors encouraged lawlessness? Alright, so this picture up here shows the Wild West. There's a picture here of some very violent behaviour in towns. People are attacking one another, vandalising buildings, things are being thrown out windows, guns are being fired, there's potentially robbers breaking in, and things like that happening. So we can actually group our factors into groups. So let's have a look at social factors. Social factors that encourage lawlessness in the West. Well, there were conflicts between the different ethnic groups. For example, in the West there were Chinese, blacks, ex-slaves, Europeans. There were lots of ethnic groups, and there was conflict between these. And often racism caused violence. Also, ex-Civil War soldiers after the US Civil War found it difficult to readjust to normal life, and they found it difficult to become a civilian once again. Another social factor that encouraged lawlessness was the conflict between the ex-Civil War soldiers. So, many ex-Civil War soldiers found it difficult to forget what they'd been fighting for even after the war, and when they settled in the West, there was still an ongoing conflict between these. So now let's have a look at some geographical factors that encourage lawlessness. we're using quite some sophisticated grouping here, so social, geographical, political, and there's some more on the next slide. So geographical factors, the West was a vast and initially sparsely populated area. So the West was really huge, it was a massive area. This meant that it was rather difficult to enforce law and order because of the large area that needed to be covered. If, say, a train robbery was happening in the West, it could take possibly a few hours for appropriate law enforcement officers to get there because the West was just so vast and transport was initially very slow. It was also sparsely populated. That means that you didn't have many people living over the vast area, so that meant that you might have to appoint a law and order official just to sort of keep an eye on 50 or so people that were living in a town. All the people weren't living together and it was sparsely populated, so that proved a problem, and it was difficult to enforce law and order because of the vast area and because how few people lived in some parts. Another group of factors that encouraged lawlessness were our political factors. So there was a shortage of reliable law officers in new mining and cow towns, and politicians would often not pay to employ new or better officers, so they didn't see it as a priority at law and order. So there are some factors that encourage lawlessness. Let's have a look at some more. There are also economic factors. So, the economic factors, what were they? Well, there were lots of people trying to make money in the West. That made it quite violent and competitive. There was also a conflict between the competing groups. Often they came into conflict with one another. For example, the cattlemen and the homesteaders, they came into conflict several times. So when the cattlemen took their cattle on cattle drives across the plains, then the homesteaders' cattle caught Texas fever. That would anger the homesteaders, and they'd come into conflict then. Also, the cattlemen came into conflict with the homesteaders in something called the Johnson County War in 1892, and we're going to be looking at that a bit more in a later video. So, conflict between competing groups. Another way that cattlemen came into conflict with homesteaders is through the invention of barbed wire. Just a bit of a side point here, but I'll mention it. When the invention of barbed wire came, and I think it's around the 1870s, I think it's 1874 off the top of my head, might be wrong though, go back and check that in the homesteaders video. So after the invention of barbed wire, homesteaders used it to mark land boundaries and fence their land, and this caused problems for homesteaders who were driving cattle across the plains. One, because cattle couldn't roam freely because of barbed wire, and also homesteaders started to do something that was rather sort of crafty in a way. Homesteaders started to fence off water holes. So they would put a barbed wire fence around water holes on the Great Plains, and this would mean that the cattlemen's cattle couldn't go to these water holes to drink because the homesteaders had put this fence around them. And the homesteaders often did this on purpose to stop cattlemen from crossing their land and hoping that it'd annoy them. And cattlemen had to perform what we call wire cuttings to cut down the barbed wire fences so their cattle could drink. So these are economic factors that encourage lawlessness. Also, there were some values and attitudes that were rather silly that also encouraged lawlessness. A few examples of these: it was your responsibility. Third time lucky. Your responsibility to sort your own problems out. You shouldn't seek help from law enforcement officers. You should sort stuff out yourself. Take the law into your own hands. This is what people believed and what people did, and that's why people became lawlessness. Because often there was a very blurred line between the criminal and the victim. Because the criminal might carry out an attack on the victim, but the victim would retaliate in such a way that they now became the criminal too, because they sorted the problem out themselves. Lots of people also carried guns, and so arguments could easily end in shootings. This was just a value of the American people in the Wild West. And also, people believed that if you shot a man in self-defense, then you did not break the law. And often there was a blurred line between if you were shooting in self-defense or if you were shooting with the intent to kill him, and this often led to disputes again, as you can probably imagine. So I've actually covered everything we need to go over for today's video. The factors that meant, that explain why the West was so wild. Okay, so here are 4 quick questions based on what we've talked about in today's video. You might want to pause the video in this position and attempt these questions independently. If not, carry on watching and we'll go through these questions together. What was the West like before the 1880s? Well, it was very violent. It was lawless. Lots of crime. The criminals were law officers, that type of thing. We've talked through that, haven't we? There were lots of outlaws and that sort of thing, famous outlaws such as Billy the Kid, who we've got up here. Question 2, give 2 examples of social factors that encourage lawlessness. Well, there were different ethnic groups, conflict between those, and also ex-Civil War soldiers found it difficult to readjust. Just try and squeeze difficult to readjust. Squeeze that in there. Hopefully you can read that. And question 3. Give 2 examples of economic factors that encourage lawlessness. Lots of people making money. They were quite competitive. They just want to make loads of money for themselves. Lots of people making money. And give 2 examples. There were also conflict between competing groups. Conflict, as we've talked about, the homesteaders and cattlemen. Groups. I've also just not mentioned, actually, I forgot to mention in this video, that law and order was also bad in mining and cow towns because they sprang up so quickly and came out of nowhere through a vast influx of cowboys and a vast influx of gold miners. We're going to be looking a bit more at the law and order problems in mining towns in this topic. Sorry, I've got that wrong. We're going to be looking at a bit more at law and order problems in cow towns later on in this topic. For law and order problems in mining towns, go back to the video on the go back to the topic on the early pioneers and watch the video on gold mining, as law and order in mining towns is explained in that video. Sorry to digress. Question 4. Why did traditional values and attitude mean the West was lawless? Well, people had sort of silly old attitudes that meant it was very violent, and an examples of these are that not illegal to shoot a man in self-defense, and also another example is sort own problems out. Sort out own problems. Your responsibility to sort out your own problems and take the law into your own hands. So there are the answers to the 4 quick knowledge recall questions for today's video. Thanks for watching this video today. I do hope you found it useful. If you have, head over to the website revisegcsehistory.co.uk to watch more videos like this. Next up in this topic is law and order in cow towns. Thanks for watching. See you soon.